Hello everyone, and welcome to another podcast of Ghost Stories with Isibella. We are actually now accepting stories from listeners, so if you have a paranormal tale that you would like to be told over the air, then you can email it to missisabella@gmail.com, and I will be leaving that email address below in the comments on the YouTube video. So yes, send us your stories and I will read them out over the air. Our first story tonight is called A Friendly Game of Cards by Thomas Kay in Savannah, Georgia, and the story takes place in 1990. Our neighbours were a young couple like us. I was in the same US Army platoon as my husband, and we used to get together to play cards. Things started to get weird when he started telling us that his wife could see ghosts, that a young girl and an old man were always with her, and that he was actually afraid of them. We didn't think much of it, as we assumed he must have been joking with us. One Friday night, my wife and I went to their apartment to play cards. The first thing they did when we got there was open the door to the second bedroom, and the husband said, "Do you feel how cold it is in here? Look at the hair on your arm. It's standing up." And it was. His wife then came behind us and said, "They are both sitting on the bed." Again I blew it off, thinking the room was colder because the door had been closed. When we started playing cards in the dining room, which was attached to the living room, my wife and I sat facing the dining room together. There were two speakers pointing away from us towards the living room, about 2 feet high. The speaker on the right hand had a stack of books on top of it. After about 10 minutes of playing, we heard what sounded like a little bell. We looked towards the living room, and to our amazement, a small bell, a few inches in size, lifted up into the air from behind the books. The decoration hovered approximately 2 feet above the speaker before it shot across the room, hitting the husband in the back of the head. My wife and I screamed. We jumped up and ran out of the apartment, and we never returned. This next story is called UFO Hunting, and on that note I would like to add that I'm more than happy to have unexplained tales as well, so you don't just have to send me ghost submissions specifically. If you have UFO stories, I'm more than happy to hear those as well. Okay, so back to the story. UFO Hunting by Don Warwick, Maricopa County, Arizona, 1982. I had been hunting at Table Mesa late one afternoon and was headed back to camp on a narrow dirt road. The road went over a berm, and on the other side I saw a light shining up that I assumed was a truck coming towards me. I got out of its way by getting off of the road, and I went into the desert. As I waited for the vehicle to pass, I noticed the light stayed in the same place. I moved up the berm to look over, and that's when I saw it, a spacecraft with strange-looking lights outside of it. The creatures on the ground were short, 3 to 4 feet tall at max, with large eyes. I aimed my gun at them immediately. As they saw me, I was terrified, and they moved quickly back into their craft. I got off the berm fast. As I was running through the desert, I tripped on a jumping cactus. It embedded deep into my leg. The craft became airborne and flew towards me, stopping directly overhead, where it hung suspended for about 15 seconds above me. I was in shock. It then accelerated very quickly and shot straight up and was gone. This is a true tale. A Real Live Nightmare by Anthony Vallis, a student in Liberty, Missouri, 2011. I was sleeping over at my friend Sandy's place one night, watching classic horror movies with her and her mother. Freddy had just disemboweled another victim in the movie, and as I watched the Sarah sloughing into the ground yet again, I convinced them to finally turn it off. I walked into the kitchen to refresh my soda. When I returned to the sofa, Sandy and her mother were visibly excited. They asked if I wanted to go to the cemetery and try to find ghosts. I couldn't say no after already having wimped out watching the movie, so we all decided to head out. As we pulled into the cemetery through its massive iron gates, Sandy and I recorded every moment on our phones. It was eerie. We drove slowly through the skinny, winding roadways that were lined with graves marked by old tombstones. In the distance, silhouettes of monuments were visible in the moonlight. As creepy as the ambience was, the ghosts were not making themselves apparent that evening. We parked our car and got out to stretch our legs in the graveyard and wander a little, still filming everything on our phones. After about half an hour, Sandy wanted to stay, but her mother wanted to go home, and I sided with her mother. As we started walking back to the car, a noise drew to my attention to the bushes to my left. The rustling drew Sandy and her mother's attention as well, but I decided to look more closely. I expected to find a small animal or something. However, what I found was a pair of large blood-red eyes staring right back at me. Whatever it was did not blink, and it gutturally growled lowly. The eyes glowed as if they emitted a light of their own. Short, thick horns that had tips as sharp as pins sat on its head, twisted up into tips. It lunged forward as the three of us turned and ran for our lives back to the car. We sped up out of that cemetery all the way back to Sandy's house. When I got out of the car, I glanced at my door and was amazed to see that it had been slashed with what appeared to be actual claw marks. Was the creature really that close to catching us? I felt physically sick, like this was all a horrible nightmare. Sandy, her mother, and I ran into the house and locked all the doors and windows immediately, and we huddled together to watch videos captured on our phone. Though we didn't see the creature in the videos, we were able to hear it. And I tell you what, it was real, a real living nightmare. Some kind of time change. Joe Wendy Carreja, a farmer in Olympia, Washington. The story takes place in June 1994. I was 33 years old in 1994. Attending my senior year of college. I returned to school after a failed marriage and worked on the campus radio station, hosting 3.5-hour shows on Thursday mornings. It was a Wednesday night in June, and I'd gotten off my children all to bed, so I settled down with my stereo and my CD collection to prepare for my radio show the next morning. I became absorbed in the process, and as I usually did when I engaged with my great love for music. I suddenly realized that the time had gotten away from me, and it was much later than I had thought. In fact, when I looked at the clock, the stereo read 12:17 a.m. I got up, grumbling, and chastised myself for not going to bed earlier, knowing I would suffer for the lack of sleep. I went into the kitchen for a glass of water and noticed the clock on the oven also read 12:18 a.m. I rolled my eyes and headed to the bedroom. Climbing into bed, I saw the clock on my nightstand as my head hit the pillow, and I cringed one more time as I resigned to my sleepless fate. It read 12:20 a.m. I closed my eyes and laid there, trying to fall asleep for what I would say was at least half an hour. Apparently I did fall asleep, because I woke up some time later in the middle of an interesting dream of which I unfortunately no longer remember. What happened next, though, I remember vividly, and surely I will never forget till the day I died. I rolled over, opened my eyes to the clock on the nightstand, which read 11:05 p.m. I bolted up into a sitting position while my hair stood up on end. My whole body had shivers. I jumped out of bed and checked the other two clocks I had looked at earlier in the kitchen and living room. They all read 11:05 a.m. How could this be possible? The next morning, as I was contemplating this weird occurrence of the previous night, the phone rang. It was my friend's daughter, asking if her mother was at my house having coffee with me, as she sometimes did. I said no, she wasn't. She then paused and asked, "Was there some kind of time change for you last night?" The chills hit me all over again, and I had no idea what to say to her. I still don't. That's quite an interesting story. I've actually encountered a couple of stories about time change or even time travel and stuff, and I always find them to be really fascinating. Like Star Trek, but without the sparkles. John Fies, retired, Verena, Wisconsin. The story takes place in 1990. I was bow hunting deer. Sorry, let's start that again. I was bow hunting deer from a deer stand 15 feet off the ground, which was covered in a foot of snow. Around 3:45 p.m., while looking through the trees and brush, I noticed some movement and detected a man walking about 40 yards away. I estimated he would pass to the right of my stand, about 30 yards distance. I looked closely at the individual and noticed he was wearing a long old wool coat. It reminded me of pictures I had seen from the 1800s, or at least turn of the century. He also wore a farmer's cap pulled down on his head, and he walked with determination, normal steps. The man walked behind 2 large oaks, and he disappeared again on the other side of them. All of a sudden, he started to fade away, much like you would see on Star Trek, but without any of the sparkles. That makes me laugh. I could not believe that I had just seen and tried to erase it from my mind. People do not just evaporate. I thought about it and rationalized that he must have turned and must actually be walking away from me behind 2 large oaks. I turned around in my stand to see the man come into view again, but I didn't see him. I got out of the tree stand and walked over to the area where I saw the man. The snow was pristine. There were no footprints in it. Had I seen a ghost, or witnessed a dimensional break and looked back into time itself? I continued to hunt in that area, and I always get up early and walk to my stand through the forest in the dark. I always fear that I may come upon the gentleman again, in the dark, face to face. Just in case I happen to meet up with him, I carry a flashlight large enough to use on the front of a train. That's interesting. I don't know, what is perhaps one of the viewers can tell me, what is a tree stand? I'm sure it's something you use in hunting. I've not heard of it before. Okay, our next story. What the hell was that? Michelle Grady, drafter and designer, Ellis County, Texas, 1992. This encounter happened many years ago, but the image of what I saw has been seared into my mind forever. One night, my friends and I decided to do something out of the ordinary. We wanted to explore the urban legends of the surrounding area. I got a call from my buddy. He wanted to pick up our friend Kay and go to an old abandoned cemetery. We had heard of all kinds of stories and legends about this place, so we wanted to see if they were true. It took an hour or so of driving, some of it down a dirt road, but we found what we thought was it. There were headstones going back to the 1800s, which seemed pretty cool to teenagers like us. We tested some of the goofy legends, and as we suspected, nothing happened. We laughed it off and started to make our way back to the car. And that's when we heard rustling in the bushes. For a moment, we stood frozen in fear, and then used a flashlight to find it was just an armadillo foraging in the ground. As we drove away laughing, we decided to take the long way back to the city, because we had a few hours before curfew. When the dirt road turned into pavement, I thought I would have some fun. I dropped into gear and I floored it. We slid sideways and then we took off. I should have been paying attention, but I wasn't. Before I knew it, we got turned around. It was dark and the corn crops were high, and we were going really, really fast. Somehow, we got off the main road and we managed to get lost. We turned down a road that was bumpy, and it was getting nerve-wracking because we didn't have a map with us. It was very late at night, and we were in the middle of nowhere. My buddy joked about the Children of the Corn movie, which I think scared him more than it did me and Kay. We came to this stop sign, and it was in a weird kind of spot. It was in the middle of a road, and it had corn on either side. No crossroad. As I stopped, I turned to Kay and Jay, and we asked, "So, do we go back the way we came, or do we—" Before I could finish, Kay's eyes got really big, and she started to shake. She mumbled, What the hell is that, Mike?" Jay and I both turned, and there in the headlights was a tall creature hunched over, walking in the cornfield in front of us. It had long arms, longer than any human being I have ever seen. The hands were curled up to the fingertips, which looked very pointed. The thing had a long snout and sort of pointed ears, and it stopped, gave us a half smile, showing its teeth. They looked like monster teeth to me. It then turned and looked directly at us as its eyes reflected the light from the headlights, and then it simply walked away. We rolled up our windows, and we sat there dumbfounded for a minute or two in fear. I looked at Jay and put the car in gear. I rolled up the 10 yards or so to where the thing had crossed the road, and there was nothing. but more corn, an old wooden telephone pole, and an old abandoned farmhouse. Kay ever so quietly said, "Mike, I want to go home. Please don't let's drive past that house, let's just go." Jay agreed, so I put it in reverse and we slowly backed up down the road and went back the way we had come. I looked one last time at the abandoned farmhouse in the rearview mirror in the moonlight. I saw movement just inside the open door. It scared me so much that I had a cold feeling go through my body. I remember flooring it, causing us to bounce and jostle our way up that crappy road. I drove a few miles, pulled over, and I actually got sick. The entire time, the other two were urging me to come on, hurry up vomiting, get back in the fucking car. We finally got to civilization, and Jay and I dropped off Kay at her house. She leaned into the passenger side window and said, "I don't want to ever talk about this. Not ever. I've never been so scared in my fucking life. If there are things like that in the world, then let's just never fucking bring it up. Come on, guys, please, just swear." She looked at both of us with tears in her eyes, and we swore to her we would never speak of it again. As Jay and I drove off, Jay stared out the window, halfway to his house, and said, "I was always told that—" He hesitated. "That monsters don't exist. But if they don't exist, then what was that?" He turned to me, and I looked at him, and I could see real fear in his eyes, and I'm sure he could see the fear in mine. And I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because the truth is, and still to this day, I didn't know what to say. We drove the rest away in silence, and all I could think is, perhaps those things are real. All three of us will never forget that night, so long as we live. That was a great story, actually. Really enjoyed that. Okay, this next story is called Pap by Gabriel Holden, chef/filmmaker from Baltimore, Maryland, and the story takes place in 1979. It was the second Saturday in November 1979, and I was up early watching cartoons. I sat in the middle of the living room when the phone started ringing over and over again. We didn't have an answering machine, and I wasn't allowed to answer the phone because I never took messages. We recently had a new number assigned to us because we'd just moved into the apartment in which I sat. I went upstairs to get Mum. Both Mum and Dad came down, and Dad started making coffee as my Mum answered the phone. It was my great-grandfather, Pap, whose name was actually Robert. He was an old Irish guy with an accent, and I remember he called me Gabriel Heater, after a guy who was on the radio during World War II. Pap had called to tell my Mum that he loved her, me and my dad, and the rest of the family, and how proud he was of us all. Being the old, stoic Irishman he was, he typically wasn't much for sentiment, but my Mum thought this call was a bit odd, and figured that the man had worked the night shift, and then threw a few drinks back, and then was feeling a little sentimental perhaps. She told him how much she loved him, and I joined in. She gave me the phone, and I yelled, "I love you, Pap!" And he said, "I will never forget this. I'm always here for you, Gabriel Heater, always." And I said, "I know, Pap, see you later," and gave the phone back to my mother. She told him goodbye and that she loved him, and then hung up. About 35 minutes later, Mother got another call and suddenly burst into tears. The Maryland State Police called to say that Pap had died about 2 hours earlier in a car accident on I-83 right outside Baltimore while driving to work. The police had found a greeting card in the car that my mother had written to her with our new number on it. And because they couldn't reach anyone else, they called us. They asked Mother to inform her family, and of course she didn't believe the officer because we had literally just talked to Pap minutes before. That was until she and my grandmother went to identify the body. I clearly remember all of the conversation surrounding the event, because Irish wakes were held in the home, and the call was all that anyone talked about. My mother tells the story every Thanksgiving dinner. I like that too, actually. I've heard a couple of stories just involving dead people calling people either on cell phones or telephones, and I'm not sure what it would be, but I really enjoy those stories a lot, actually. The backpacking journey John F., Electrical Systems Engineer. I can't pronounce this for the life of me. Monongahela National Forest. I hope I didn't ruin the pronunciation of that. West Virginia, 1992. Years ago, my wife and I went backpacking in West Virginia, near the Seneca Rocks region. After driving to a park, we had dinner at a nice restaurant. We were eavesdropping on a table next to us, and the conversation they were having chilled us. They spoke of practicing witches in the region. After leaving a restaurant, we found a nearby camping supply store. As we returned to the car, a man came running across the street, frantically screaming, "Do you see the smoke? Did you see the explosion from inside the store?" I had no idea what he was talking about, so I dashed back to my car and left immediately. The next morning, we backpacked into the forest and made camp along the trail. Later that night, I awoke to the sounds of light raindrops tapping on our tent. In the morning, however, there was no sign of any moisture on the tent or on the ground. The sky was very clear. We broke down camp and hiked further into the forest. We left the trail, deciding to follow a creek that entered into a valley with a series of beaver ponds. As we made camp at the last of the ponds at dusk, the wind began to blow, and it seemed to have an almost intelligence, as we could hear it approaching us, but it never touched us as it passed into the bending trees. Other times it would find us. Our campfire gave us some comfort, but that comfort was broken by a short, loud scream that repeated every 10 to 15 minutes. The scream circled around us, but it did not approach us. We were so scared, but as we went into our tent to sleep, I took one last look at the star-filled sky, and I grabbed my axe. A minute after turning the tent light off, I heard the tapping sounds that I had heard the previous night on the tent. We knew these were not raindrops now, and we imagined flicking tapping of fingernails on the tent outside. I couldn't stand it any longer, so I turned on the light, and tapping it stopped immediately. I took my axe and I went out of the tent door to see if anything was there. Nothing was seen. No rain, no moisture or clouds, only the star-filled sky overhead. After returning to the tent and extinguishing the light, it started again. We couldn't believe it. I told my wife that at least it seemed not to be trying to come inside, but I did hold on to my axe tightly. 5 minutes later, the sound finally stopped, but I slept very lightly for the rest of the night, only hearing the beavers gnawing on the wood in the ponds. The next morning, as we stepped out of the tent, we were greeted by a large bird that was somehow waiting for us. We watched it fly down the valley towards us, and when it swooped down at us, both my wife and I screamed and dropped to our knees, feeling as if somehow this bird was trying to attack us as it passed merely a few feet over our heads with its large claws. It flew off and did not return. Hoping to find some source to the clues of the screams from the night before, or rather, hoping to find some clues as to the source of the screams from the night before, we hiked up the hill. Halfway up, I noticed something standing about 20 feet ahead. As I looked up in an attempt to see it more clearly, it was suddenly gone. But I swear I thought I'd just seen a soldier standing there before us in an old uniform, as clear as day. I questioned myself as whether I'd really seen this apparition, but before I could say anything, my wife behind me excitedly asked if I had just seen the soldier standing in front of us as well. An electric chill went through me. We continued up the hill with our eyes wide open now. I was ready for anything, and the levels of my fear were high. As we reached the crest, I noticed a clearing. The clearing on this remote hilltop was about 150 feet in diameter, and was planted with grass that was thick, overgrown to a point where it bent over due to its height and weight. In the middle of the clearing, which is shaped like a pentagram, there was a circular ring about 40 feet in diameter of young evergreen trees, each about the same height. The ring had a wide slot for entry within, and had the same overgrown grass. The other end of the clearing, there was a bulldozed path coming down the far end of the other side of the hill. We returned to our campsite and found many animal footprints, as if the animals had inspected it while we were off inspecting the hilltop. Our last night camping was undisturbed, except for the beavers doing their usual work. The next morning my thoughts were of returning back home, and that's when I realised what time of year it was. My hair rose on the back of my neck as I asked my wife whether or not she realised that we had just spent Halloween in the creepy wilderness alone. When I returned to my job, I remembered a secretary who annually visited Salem, Massachusetts on Halloween in order to join the other witches there. I described our weird backpacking experience to her, and she responded that the hilltop was a well-known witches' ceremonial site, and that they were playing with us and our minds on Halloween. She remarked my wife and I must have had a very strong mental state to have withstood it. Since this revelation, I always think of returning one day with more protection, friends, and perhaps a Rottweiler or two. That was actually a really good story. I wonder if that clearing is still there. I really love, being British, we have a lot of pagan sort of ancestry going on there, but I've always had a thing for Wiccan and witch stories, so that was good. This story is called The Sweaty Man by Melinda Warren, Nursing Unit Secretary, Kansas City, Missouri, 1981 to 1984. When I was almost 16, I got my first job as a maid at the local Holiday Inn. After you worked there for a while, you were assigned a permanent station. Mine was on the 3rd floor of the south wing of the hotel, and I had 15 rooms to clear per day. It was a late afternoon and very quiet. Most of all the guests had already checked out, and I was going about my routine. I returned to see a man standing in the room. He was about 45, balding, and wearing a white T-shirt, grey sweatpants-style shorts, and white short socks and tennis shoes. He was sweating profusely, as if he had just been out for a run. He asked me if I had found a small gold ring. I told him no, but if I did, I would turn it into the front desk. He left the room. I went into the hallway shortly thereafter, and he had disappeared. The room I was cleaning was not near an exit, but I just brushed it off and went back to work. A few months later, I was again simply working through my stationed rooms when I sensed someone behind me suddenly. I turned to see the man, dressed in sweaty clothes, standing in the room again. I vaguely recalled his face, but when he asked about the ring again, I knew of the previous occurrence. I again told him that if I found the gold ring, I would return it to the front desk, and again he walked into the hallway and this time seemingly disappeared into thin air in front of me. This same course of events happened to me 17 times during a period of 3.5 years, and every time he would always ask for the ring. The last time it had happened, I was not working on my usual station. This time I was on the 1st floor, on the north side of the building, facing the parking lot. It was summer, and I was cleaning. I looked out the window, and I saw the man walking across the asphalt in bare feet. It was 100 degrees outside, and the parking lot was topped with tar. A few seconds later, I turned to see the very same man in the room with me. A chill ran up my spine when I realized this was the same man from before. I hadn't seen him for at least 6 months at this point, and this time, ominously, he carried a small canvas bag that he set on the dresser before me. It clanged when he set it down, which startled me, wondering what was inside. I felt real fear for the first time, and I immediately brushed by him to leave the room. I went to get my supervisor, but the strange, sweaty man had once again vanished by the time we returned to the room. Through the years, I thought he might be just some kind of stalker, but he always looked the same, dressed the same, and asked me the same question. It would also explain his uncanny ability to disappear into thin air. That was great. So with that, I'm going to draw our podcast for today to a close. I want to thank you all for listening, and again, if you have a story that you would like to submit, then please email it to missisabella@gmail.com, and I will read it out over the air. Thank you guys. Take care.